Well, the country's inflation rate has this week hit a 13-year high, with the cost of fuel and food registering the highest price increases. Now, these increases have led to a severe cost of living crisis, with many South Africans, young and old, currently unemployed or unable to even study. Let's speak then to people who are studying. The South African Union of Students spokesperson, Asive Dlanjwa, joins us now. Asive, and you say even at institutions of higher learning, the cost of living crisis is being felt.
Good evening, Butimegil, and also evening to your viewers. Absolutely. In fact, we cannot overemphasize the impact which it has had on our students, primarily based on the premise that our students, in any case, are members of community before they are students. So that whatever has been the brunt of the high inflation on the general community and South Africans at large, they have also experienced the same challenges and the same negative impact. But we believe, because of the nature of the sector and the vulnerability of our students, there are times where we are of the view that in fact they have been overly exposed. Why do we say this? The reality is that some of the items that have contributed significantly to the inflation, to the rise in inflation, are some of items that are critical and that are basic in the staple diets of our students. I am speaking of issues such as bread and cereals, which recorded 11.2 increase. We're speaking of meat, 9.5 increase, and oils, which is obviously cooking oil, is a basic component of cooking and preparing majority of meals that our students eat, which would have risen by 32.5%. So all of these things put together have really had a negative impact, but also on the allowance that students are getting, the NSFAS allowance, because the buying power and the ability for it to be able to afford our students decent meals, but also to be able to afford them decent accommodation and transport. All of these things have been compromised, are being compromised through this inflation that we are seeing. And what we are realizing is that, by the way, in fact, that a lot of our students already, Tembegile, are using the very little allowances that they get to support families back home because of the poverty that is being experienced at home. So all of these things put together are really going to expose our students to more vulnerabilities and all forms of exploitations, including but not limited to abductions, as we have seen in the past, sexual assault and gender-based violence and femicide.
So
all of these things are connected.
What needs to happen then, Asive, given that if you're getting a bursary, even from the National Student Financial Aid Scheme or a private institution, it's unlikely that there's enough flexibility to add more money to that halfway through the year, because the cost of living is completely out of control for many people?
No, Tembegile, there has to be an intervention. So one of the first things that we are calling for is that the department must undergo an urgent study and assessment of what has been the impact of the economic woes on our students. Now, yes, we appreciate that maybe the allowances might not necessarily be adjusted during the academic year, but there are all sorts of fundings and grants that government gives to institutions throughout the year for various projects. So we are saying the department working with institutions, let them be able to come up with a plan to be able to cushion the blow on students. How has this been done in other instances? All institutions have what we call health and wellness offices. Some of them have food banks. So they must be able to, and in the past, because you are an NSFAS recipient, etc., you would probably not be eligible for certain provisions such as the food banks, etc., because they would call it double dipping. But now we are saying those provisions must be brought back and they must be used to cushion. When it comes to transport, institutions and some universities and colleges, they have their own transport systems. Let us see how, working with local taxi associations and the transport industry with institutions, how once again are we able to, even if we subsidize their transportation, because it is pointless to invest billions into students and then they are dropped out because of what has been the impact of the economic crisis on them, and they are not able to carry on. So there has to be a study that is undertaken to understand exactly what has been the impact of the inflation on the students. And the impact, obviously, that it would have on the allowances, etc.
Right. You mentioned food banks. You're at the University of the Free State, if I recall, and when I was there many years ago, there was indeed a food bank. It had just started, in fact, at the time, and there was a massive call for donations. But I wonder how well-resourced food banks and the like are at South African campuses today, given that so many other people, even those who live off campus, are also battling or struggling to make ends meet.
There are institutions that do have food banks, but the reality has been that also, one, because of COVID and the impact it has had on businesses and some donors, they have been drying up significantly. This is why we saw that during the pandemic, I think it was 2021, that at least about 60% of our students were still going to bed without food. So the reality is that I think a lot of work can be done, and once again, this is where we think private sector can come to the fore to be able to assist institutions to be able to resource these food banks, because we really believe they will go a long way. And we cannot emphasize, in fact, again, the issue that many of our students are sending those allowances back home as they are. So this is to deal with the argument that has been made, but no, they are receiving NSFAS allowances for food. But the reality is that they come from impoverished backgrounds, and they use those allowances to support their families. So these food banks are absolutely critical in ensuring that we deal with food insecurity in our institutions of higher learning.
And the problem, of course, that we need to revisit when you talk about the cost of living crisis, Asive, is that there's still that category, the so-called missing middle, people who are seen by the system as being too rich, not too rich perhaps, but getting too much of a family income to qualify for the provisions made for the poor, but also they don't have enough money to get through the university journey as smoothly at a financial level. And this will no doubt compromise their standing, because many of them would have been in limbo anyway, unable to qualify perhaps for a loan with a bank, but also in as fast saying your family income is above the threshold.
Absolutely, Butemigele. In fact, we would have seen that missing middle often falls within the middle class bracket in terms of our economy, and they are probably going to bear the biggest branch of this, especially if you couple that inflation with the increase in the repo rate. Because already, as you have said, that they are not able to afford their education because they overqualify in terms of the prescriptions of NSFAS, but also they do not have enough money to be able to pay for themselves. And what we have seen is that the majority of these students, their parents are locked up in many loans and debt repayments. In fact, a recent study suggested, Tembegile, that 60% of these workers spend more than 40% of their wages and salaries on debt repayment, meaning that now you can imagine that whatever they had been already paying, which was further depleting their disposable income, it will be further depleted and diminished, meaning their ability to afford basic goods and services and basic needs really is going to be severely compromised. Because even their savings, the argument that no, this will assist in terms of savings and the returns on savings. But if you already are spending more than 40% of your salary on debt repayments, it means that with the repo rate going up, you are going to be obviously paying more, and whatever you could have been able to save, you will not be able to save. So which means it really offsets whatever could have been the advantages or possible advantage of them being able to save. So we are really concerned. You are very correct. We are really concerned about the missing middle, and we carry on. We know that the department has been undergoing a study. There's a task team that has been put together, but we think it's about time that we finalize the funding model for that category of students, or else really they might not survive the crisis in which we find ourselves in.
Asive Dlanjwa, good to speak to you. Asive is with the South African National Union of Students, speaking to us about the impact of the cost of living crisis on students at the country's universities.